Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 837 for September 20th, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
I built this still myself. I just bought some copper and welded up. It was probably nearly 10 years ago I started it and been running nearly 9 years now.
Back in 2014, we first met Peter Bignell of Tasmania's Belgrove Distillery in episode 489. Back then, his farm distillery was just starting to build its reputation for both its rye whiskey and a bit of character, such as his fuel source, the spent cooking oil from the fish and chips shop down the road that made Belgrove one of the few distilleries anywhere at the time using renewable energy. Since then, Belgrove's whiskies have received wider acclaim worldwide. I visited the distillery last year during my trip to Australia, and to be honest, it took me a while to make sense of what I saw. It's like no other distillery I've ever seen before. I'll take you on a tour of Belgrove on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and...
It's not a case of a whiskey maker coming and changing everything, because that's just a silly thing to do.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news, and once again we have to start with politics. Craft distillers could wind up becoming collateral damage in the political battles now being fought in Washington. And that was the case even before the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg Friday night, which has created even more controversy over the confirmation fight that is coming for her successor. Remember last December's battle to extend the federal excise tax cut for distillers on the first 100,000 proof gallons they remove from bonded storage for sale each year. That extension came down to a vote on the last evening before Congress went home for the Christmas holiday recess, and it was only extended for 1 year. That means another extension, or a vote to make the cut permanent, will be needed before the end of the lame duck session that follows November's election, or the tax cut will expire at midnight on New Year's Eve. There's not a lot of time to get it done. Congress still needs to pass a continuing budget resolution in order to prevent another federal government shutdown on October 1st. But there's a disagreement on just how long that should last, until late November or early December after the election, or until late January after the next Congress begins. There are also tense negotiations over whether another coronavirus relief package can get a vote before the election, and on top of that, most lawmakers want to get home as soon as they can to campaign for re-election November 3rd. The lame duck session could start as early as mid-November, and it's likely that that will be the best shot at a vote on the federal excise tax break. The Distilled Spirits Council and the American Craft Spirits Association held their annual public policy conference virtually this week in Washington, instead of having distillers descend on Capitol Hill. Oregon Democratic Senator Ron Wyden has been trying to get a permanent excise tax break for years. He spoke at the conference via Zoom.
We're going to try to bring everybody together, and I do think that there are some priorities that can be shared and give everybody the predictability and certainty they need to grow their businesses in the private economy. And if anything, the permanent legislation that we're talking about today is more important today during the COVID pandemic, during the monstrous forest fires that we've seen in my part of the country that have taken such a toll.
Missouri Senator Roy Blunt is part of the GOP's leadership team in the Senate and the lead co-sponsor on the tax reform bill with Wyden. Blunt's comments came in a pre-recorded message to the conference.
Those reforms create a fair and equitable tax structure for brewers and winemakers and distillers. And as we navigate through the economic crisis brought on by the pandemic, you shouldn't have to be worried about whether those decreases turn into significant increases in your federal excise taxes in January of next year.
This is one of the few things that Republicans and Democrats do agree on, with widespread support among both parties in both the House and Senate. But with a Supreme Court confirmation now likely to add to the tension in the Senate, Wyden says one obstacle is in the way to getting passage of the tax reform bill out of the way now.
Mitch McConnell clearly has the ability right now to say this is one of his priorities and he wants to take our bipartisan bill and make it permanent. So I would hope, as you all have follow-up contacts, that you tell him, because he's got a hard-hit hospitality sector, that you want our bill to be permanent. And the ball is to a great extent in his court.
As Majority Leader, the Kentucky Senator controls the Senate's agenda and decides which bills come to the floor for a vote. He has supported federal excise tax reform in the past, but has not scheduled the legislation for floor debate this year. In other whiskey news, Colin Scott retired as the master blender for Chivas Brothers earlier this summer, but shocked everyone with a return to the industry this week. He has joined the Last Drop Distillers as its master blender, and his first release will come out sometime next year. It's a reunion for Colin Scott with Last Drop co-founder James Espy. They and Espy's partner in founding the Last Drop, the late Tom Jago, worked together at Chivas Brothers years ago and were responsible for creating the Chivas Regal 18-year-old. It's been 18 months since the Glenturret distillery in Scotland was sold. Lalique Group Chairman Silvio Denz and Swiss entrepreneur Hans-Jörg Weiss led the joint venture to buy one of Scotland's oldest distilleries. Wednesday, the Glenturret unveiled a new range of single malts along with new packaging. Managing Director John Laurie joined us on the Whiskey Wednesday webcast shortly after the announcement.
We had the launch planned for a little bit earlier this year, but with COVID, production was slowed down a little bit. Dry goods supplies had slowed down. Of course, people had to stay safe and stay at home. So we had the decision: do we postpone and move to next year, or do we move ahead? And we felt that, you know what, we were ready to move ahead. Our distillery has been around for an awful long time, and it's been through worse than this. So therefore, if we can do it and we're ready to do it, then we should do it.
Former Macallan whiskey maker Bob Dalgarno created a new triple wood Glenturret expression. He replaced the 10-year-old with a new peat smoked 10-year-old and created new 12, 15, 25, and 30-year-old expressions as well. Edrington owned the Glenturret for years while Dalgarno was at the Macallan. He was part of the Zoom webinar unveiling the range Wednesday.
I'd seen whiskies from across the group and many outside the group. I mean, we spent as blenders, we spent a number of time, a bit of time together throughout the group. I'd worked with, John Ramsey in a previous life, Marks McFarlane, Gordon Motion, and so we worked through quite a lot. But I hadn't spent that much time with Glenturret, so it was quite refreshing to come in and also have your own view of how you see the whiskies.
The new whiskies are available now in the UK, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, China, and Taiwan, with a U.S. debut expected in January. There's no word on pricing. And there's a name change for another distillery. Kentucky's O.Z. Tyler Distillery is no more. As of this past week, it's now known as the Green River Distilling Company. While Terra Sentia still owns the distillery in Owensboro, the name is a throwback to the name of the original distillery on that site that opened in 1885. Master Distiller Jacob Call also joined us on the Whiskey Wednesday webcast this week.
We've really had our eyes on Green River since the beginning, since we purchased the facility back in 2014. And, sometimes it takes a while for those deals to come together. But I don't want to say it's a no-brainer. But for us, being able to bring back a historic brand that was the most advertised whiskey brand before Prohibition to its original site and original home in 1885, that just doesn't happen very often. So for us, it was almost a no-brainer for us.
Terrasentia acquired the rights to the Green River name from the descendants of John W. McCulloch, who founded the distillery in 1885. The first release under the Green River name will be a 4-year-old straight bourbon to be released in early 2021. Hudson Whiskey is not getting a new name, but William Grant & Sons is giving its whiskeys from Tuttletown Spirits in New York's Hudson River Valley a new look and feel. They're dropping the long-time labels and expressions in place of new bourbon and rye whiskeys. The lineup includes Bright Lights Big Bourbon, Do the Rye Thing, and Backroom Deal. That one is a straight rye whiskey finished in peated Scotch whiskey barrels. There's also Short Stack, which is a straight rye finished in maple syrup casks. Hudson has also dropped its traditional 375 ml bottles in favor of the standard size 750 ml bottles. Recommended retail prices will range from $39.99 to $55 a bottle. Hudson Master Distiller Brendan O'Rourke will be one of the guests on this week's Whiskey Wednesday webcast. Compass Box is celebrating its 20th anniversary with a new version of Hedonism, the blended grain Scotch whiskey that started it all. Hedonism Felicitas is blended from 3 single-grain whiskeys spanning the last 3 decades. It was created by whiskey maker James Saxon and Compass Box founder John Glazer, and will be available in limited amounts. The U.S. recommended retail price is $175 a bottle, and John Glazer will be hosting an online virtual tasting next Sunday. There's a link for more details on our calendar of events at the WhiskyCast website. Kilchoman is marking its 15th anniversary later this year. It's out now with the 10th anniversary edition of its 100% Islay single malt. This one is a 9-year-old whiskey distilled with barley grown on the farm next to the distillery on Islay. It comes from 39 bourbon casks and 2 Oloroso sherry butts. It'll be available worldwide with a recommended retail price of £72 in the UK. U.S. pricing for 750 ml bottles has not been announced. Douglas Lang & Company is releasing its 2020 Big Pete Christmas edition. As with all of the Big Pete editions, it's an Islay blended malt. This one is bottled at cask strength, 53.1% ABV. It'll be available in Europe, North America, and Asia. The recommended retail price is around £53 or $69 a bottle. Ireland's Waterford Distillery has released more of its early single farm estate whiskies. There are 1.1 versions available from Sheaston and Ballymorgan farms, now available in the UK and Europe, while the first Waterford U.S. releases will go on sale next month. The English Whiskey Company is releasing a new gently smoked sherry cask single malt. It's bottled at 46% ABV and is available through the distillery's website. The price tag, £56.50 a bottle. The anniversary of Prohibition's repeal is still a couple of months away, but MGP is releasing this year's edition of the Remus Repeal Reserve Bourbon early this year. It's a 12-year-old bourbon blended from 2 different mash bills, distilled back in 2008. It'll sell for around $85 a bottle. Colorado's Stranahan's Distillery is releasing its oldest whiskey yet. Mountain Angel is a 10-year-old American single malt that the Angels must have loved. That's because the dry mountain air took a lot out of the barrels, with some losing up to 80% of their whiskey over that 10 years. As a result, fewer than 500 bottles will be available. The recommended retail price is around $130 a bottle. India's Paul John Distillery will be releasing the second whiskey in its Zodiac series this November. Mithuna gets its name from the Indian equivalent of the zodiac sign for Gemini. It'll be available worldwide. There's no word on pricing. 2 notes on the charity front. First, a few minutes ago, we heard from Senator Ron Wyden, who mentioned how the wildfires have devastated the U.S. West Coast. Portland-based House Spirits has now pledged to donate $10 for every bottle of its Westward single malt whiskey sold in Oregon through the end of this month to the American Red Cross. And the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, Kentucky, will be holding its annual Art of Bourbon auction this coming Thursday night. In past years, it's been a gala event at the museum with dinner and live music, in addition to an auction of rare bourbons and other goodies. Of course, that's not possible this year because of the pandemic. Instead, the auction will take place live online with free registration available. There's a link for details at the WhiskyCast website. And finally, I need to give you an update on one of our stories from last time around. We reported that the Kentucky Bourbon Festival was planning to hold the annual World Championship Bourbon Barrel Relay, despite the decision to hold the rest of the festival online. Teams from participating distilleries would have competed at separate times, with the event to be streamed online on the final day of the festival. Those plans have now changed after some of the distilleries expressed concerns about the risk of spreading COVID-19 through the teams. And as a result, festival officials have now decided to cancel this year's competition for safety reasons. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. Time now for the calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. I mentioned the Speed Art Museum's Art of Bourbon auction this Thursday a minute ago. McTeers has its next auction of rare whiskies on Friday in Glasgow, Scotland, with online bidding available. And Bonham's will have its next whiskey auction October 7th in Edinburgh, Scotland, also with online bidding. The Los Angeles Scotch Club will go ahead with its annual Peatin' Meetin' event this coming Saturday, but as a private event for club members only to comply with local health restrictions. 40 Creek Distillery in Grimsby, Ontario, will have its annual Whiskey Weekend events virtually this Saturday instead of live events at the distillery. The virtual version of the Whiskey Show in London will take place online October 2nd through the 9th and will be part of the show this year with a number of events during the week. The Whiskey Colors Festival, sponsored by the Whiskey Shop Duffton, will take place online October 8th through the 12th. And the virtual version of this year's Kentucky Bourbon Festival will be October 15th through the 18th. Of course, all in-person events are subject to change on short notice depending on public health restrictions, so make sure you double-check before you make any travel plans. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of Virginia's most awarded spirits. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online, too. Visit the Where to Buy page at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing. pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. Whiskey distilling started centuries ago on the farms as a way for farmers to turn their grain into something that would not spoil, and perhaps provide a diversion from life on the farm, too. While distilling largely moved away from the farms a long time ago, it's returning to its roots as part of the small-scale distilling movement with a lot of so-called grain-to-glass distilleries. You'll find them all over the world. And perhaps there's no one that defines the concept of grain-to-glass quite like Peter Bignell of Belgrove Farm Distillery in Tasmania, Australia. He not only grows his own grain and makes award-winning rye whiskey from it, but he built the distillery himself, and he even built a peat smoker out of an old clothes washer and dryer. He uses that smoker for more than just peat. Celebrity chef Gordon Ramsay found that out earlier this year when he and his crew visited Belgrove for the series Gordon Ramsay Uncharted. I was there last August during a trip to Tasmania, and Peter gave us a tour that I will never forget. The wind never really stops blowing in the hills of Tasmania. Belgrove Farm is about 90 minutes north of Hobart and set back a mile or so off the Midland Highway near the town of Kempton. There are dozens of sheep grazing in the field by the barn that houses Peter Bignell's distillery. They also feed on the spent grains from the distillery and play another role in some of Peter's whiskey.
Once the sheep eat it, they take all the goodies out of it, they pop it out, and we've collected some sheep dung and we've used that to burn instead of the peat. So I've got a whiskey which is actually sold out except for a few museum bottles called the Holy Shit. So it's smoky whiskey, but it's been smoked with sheep dung instead of peat. So it does the full circle around here.
That's one sign that this distillery is a lot different from other distilleries, even though they all operate on the same principles.
We grow the grain, we malt it, and the next step's mashing. So we used to try and mash exactly the same as they do the malt whiskey, because I learnt from Bill, as most people here in Tasmania learnt from Bill Lark, so I tried to do rye the same, mash it with a louder screen, and the rye doesn't have a husk on it. Barley's got a lovely tough husk that makes a filter bed of its own, and it's almost like a gravel bed in the bottom of the mash tun. And so the sugary water, the wort runs through that and just strains itself, clears it up. But rye just doesn't have that tough husk, and oats that I do, mostly those two, they don't have that tough husk on them. And so it just blocked that filter screen. So what we had to do, we had a wooden paddle. We used to keep scraping that screen for a day and a half just to keep it clean, to try and get as much sugar out as we could. I didn't really know at that stage when I very first started how the Americans did it with putting the whole grain through the fermenter and the still. But anyway, so it used to take us a day and a half. What we found in that time was that actually a wild fermenter start. We'd get lactobacillus getting in there, and we'd go right acidic, and we'd just occasionally the mash would actually start bubbling before we even got it filtered. But I discovered that makes these beautiful fruity notes. We get that lactic acid, we get a little bit of ethanol that combined form these esters, really, really fruity esters. And so we don't do that scraping the screen anymore, so we've got a much, much easier process after a lot of experimentation with all sorts of ways of trying it. So we just cook it up in this vat now. So this is an old dairy vat. We've got hot water from a boiler out the back there that actually runs on old fish and chip oil, which I get just down the road here at Moodfood, where you would have done the U-turn down there. Then we heat the water up so it comes into here almost boiling, and then when it's full, it's about 92 degrees. We add our gristed grain. This is just the raw grain, not malted to that, and cook it. So we basically cook this big vat of porridge. We played about with different temperatures, and it just seems to work better right up in the 90s, even though by theory you don't need to go that high, but we got much better yields at that. cool it down to about 70 degrees, add our wet green malt paste to it, stir it through, and those enzymes get to work and convert all that starch into sugar. But we try to mimic what we used to do before, where we got that sour, well, it's a sour mash. It's the old-fashioned type of sour mash, I believe. So what we do then, we hook this big hose here onto this tap and pump it through this, which is actually a filter press. It's a very gentle filter press. So if you've got to have a look in there, and you see on the sides there's a cloth there that's a filter, and it runs through those rollers, and that squeezes all the juice out. We move this around in the doorway, so the mash goes in this end, the juice gets squeezed out of the wort, comes out the bottom here through a heat exchanger to cool down to the right temperature for adding the yeast. Solids get scraped off the belt out the door there into a trailer, and it gets off down to feed the sheep.
The fermenters are recycled wine vatting barrels, nearly 8 feet tall. Peter Bignell bought them in pieces and brought them to the farm, where he put them back together himself.
Put it all back together again. I've got 2 of them. I'm about to get another couple of them, so we're fermenting those now. If you want to, you can climb up the ladder and stick your nose in there. That ferment, I think it was Friday last bit went in there, so it's fairly well fermented out. It's still ticking away very slowly, but you're most welcome to climb up, stick your nose in there and have a look.
Bignell is a 6th-generation Australian with family roots in Scotland, and just like the early Scottish farmers, he found his way into distilling.
I got the job up in Nant. You would have seen the watermill and the millstones and things. I restored all that while they've been in distilling. I got intrigued by distilling. I was actually offered a job there because I've got an ag science degree and understood all the basic science of fermenting and distilling, and I turned the job down. I didn't want to work for anybody else, so I came back here, and a couple of years later I had a really good crop of rye grain, and I harvested all to sell it, and I couldn't sell it, and I was stuck with it. And anyway, this little light bulb of whiskey came on. I built a whiskey distillery, used it instead of letting it rot in the granary.
Bill Lark is considered the father of Australian craft distilling, but he admits that Peter Bignell takes things to a whole new level.
We all love to call him Gyro Gearloose or Gadget Man because he's just so innovative and inventive, and he's game to do things that a lot of people aren't. And for that, we love him to bits. And look what he's coming up with. They're just sensational, stunning drinks. And thank goodness Pete's around.
I mean, you look at this place and you're thinking, wow, it's like Willy Wonka's laboratory almost.
Yeah, Willy Wonka, Go-Go Gadget. But isn't it fantastic? It never ceases to amaze me. People come here and they just come away and the word they're using is wow.
Lark's basic still design is widely used by Australian distillers, but as with pretty much everything else at Belgrove, Peter Bignell's fingerprints are all over it.
I built this still myself. I just bought some copper and welded up. It was probably nearly 10 years ago I started it, and been running nearly 9 years now. It's a really compact still because that's the condenser sitting there on the top. That's a double layer of copper, so we got water between the 2 skins of copper. It's a Bill Lark design so the steam comes up in there, touches on the cold straight above it, trickles down the inside, and there's a little gutter there that round the edge that catches it and directs it out here. It's run on direct flame heating. There's a burner down there that runs on fish and chip oil. Now all we do is just strain the bigger bits of chips and things out of it. Compressor there blows air through a couple of nozzles, and that creates a venturi and sucks the hot oil because the little oil box there's got a heating element in it, so hot oil goes through the nozzles and it creates a fog in there. Then we light it, so it's like a big flamethrower out across the bottom of the still there. So the wash run, we've got tiny bit of flour in there, a little bit of grain, a little bit of yeast, a little bit of unfermentable sugar. So in the bottom of the still we get what's called Maillard reaction. We get a little bit of browning, scorching on the bottom of the still, and it gives all my whiskies, all my products here, a little smoky note. It's fairly subtle. Some people pick it up really, really well, but it's just a slight smoky note all through it. But it's that Maillard reaction, which is the same reaction when you cook a piece of fish on a grill rather than on a steamer. It's that browning. So we do our wash run. What comes out here will be around about 25% at average. If we're doing wine, it's more up around 35%. We'll catch it in one of these drums. We'll do about 3 runs. We'll store it up in one of these tanks above us, depending on what we're doing. When we've got enough there to do the spirit run, which is used about every 4th day, we'll give the still a really good clean out, because that brown on the bottom, if we let it build up, it'll burn. So it'll actually end up with burnt. There's a couple of barrels down there where we did let it build up too much, and I've got written on them burnt. It's going to be very interesting to see what they're like when they mature. It's not unpleasant, but it is actually a burnt taste. It may be really, really nice. It may not be, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I wasn't going to throw it out. So we clean it out, do a spirit run. The spirit run, we cut it 4 ways. So a lot of people only do 3 ways. I think there's quite a few Americans do it 4 ways. So the very first little bit that comes out, it's got that little bit of that methanol in it. It's just got nasties from the strip from inside the still, because the first bit of vapour that comes off is really high in alcohol, and it's like paint stripper inside the still. It cleans the still. So we keep that, probably a couple of litres of that in this 700 litre size still, and then we actually use as fuel. So we'll store it into drums, and every now and again we've got a little pump there. We just pump it in under the still there and use it as fuel, and it burns like crazy. The flue on here glows red hot when we're running the heads through it. So, and one of the other distilleries down Hobart dropped me off 600 litres of their heads the other day, so we got more fuel there. Then we have our true 4 shots, we call them, which has still got a bit of that nasty in it, but it's got some lovely fruity notes starting to come. So we don't want to throw that out, so we keep that to recycle it. Then we come on to the heart of the run.
Let's take a cut of our own for a second here. Remember that Peter Bignell built the still himself. Listen carefully for a second.
I suppose you all know that you build copper stills for whisky, especially because there's a bit of sulphur in the grain. And the sulphur reacts to the copper, makes copper sulphate, and it slowly eats the still away. So there are actually a couple of bits of gaffer tape on there. There's a couple of holes there I've got to get round to welding up. It's only a matter of time to get them done.
That's right. He's running a still with holes in it covered by gaffer tape, heated by an open flame burner, fueled by 4 shots off the still, and oil from the fish and chips shop on the main highway.
Peter, I have to ask, has the fire inspector ever seen this place?
No. I was in the volunteer fire brigade for many, many years. I was group captain even. And direct flame still is actually, it's a device to stop explosions, because you're continually consuming any vapours that are in the air. I can pretty sure we're not going to get an explosion in this place. We may get a fire, but we're not going to get an explosion. And the fire, alcohol fire, as long as you're straight onto it, and it's not too big, it's very easy to control, just with water. So having been in the fire brigade, I understand all these things. I understand a lot of the science of fire, and I'm quite happy to have a burner going there, because if we get any fumes building up in here, they're just going to get consumed at a very slow rate by that flame. It's the same reason they have flame stacks on oil refineries and oil rigs. It's to consume any vapours that are in the area. You'd think, why would you have a flame on top of an oil refinery? And there's all that explosive stuff there. It's to get rid of anything that is potentially explosive. If you're near an oil refinery and that flame goes out, you watch out, you might have some big trouble. Yeah.
If the flame goes out, that's when you start running.
Yes, when it goes out, yes.
Remember, he's a professional. Don't try this at home.
I've got hydrometers there that, they're made out of glass. They can't taste or smell, so they don't know what it tastes like. Someone said at such and such a number is where the taste comes right. I don't know. I'd much rather trust my taste buds and the other guy. There's 2 of us that mainly work in here. Between us, we'll decide when to do the cuts. If we're not sure, we'll have a bit of a chat between us and decide. But it's purely on smell when we go from that 4 shots into the heart of the run. When we get to the coming towards the tails at the end of the heart, we start tasting as well. Rye gets this fairly obvious cut, which is way lower percentage, because I have occasionally measured it to see what it is. It's way lower than the malt whisky people get. It starts to smell like hot bread, and that's got those beautiful rye notes in it, and a lot of that mouthfeel starts coming in then. And especially if we're doing a smoky whisky, a lot of that smoke there comes towards the end. But very soon after that hot bread note, it goes to like it's boiled yeast. We want to build up flavour. All I do here is flavour. It's flavour for it's maximum good flavours we can possibly get. Good smell, good flavours. I don't care how much alcohol's in it. That's not important to me. I'd say unfortunately we need the alcohol there because it carries the flavours. So it just has to be there. But that's not a primary concern at all. There's no decisions made about alcohol concentration at all. So it's all about taste and smell.
Of course, some of that taste also comes from the barrels. And there are barrels of whiskey everywhere, even in the rafters of the barn over our heads.
We got a little winch just in here that we haul the empty barrels up with, and then we just pump the spirit into them. And then it's easy, we just siphon them back out again when they're ready.
Gravity feed, right?
Gravity feed out. Yeah, you've got to pump it in though. But it matures really quickly up there because the temperature fluctuates like crazy. This last summertime, some days it was fluctuating by 30 degrees Celsius in a single day. It got up to 47 Celsius and then drops down to about 15 at night. So that really makes the whisky crank in and out of the wood because the pressure inside the barrel's changing so much. And at night it cools right down and we actually end up with a vacuum. You come in here in the morning and try to pull a bung out, and it's very hard to get out in the morning, but occasionally it'll actually blow out in the daytime. The ones up the top there build up so much pressure, probably only because they weren't banged in properly, but you very definitely get a big pressure inside the barrels, and it's just pushing the whisky in and out of the wood. It's like getting a tea bag and jiggling it instead of just letting it sit there in the tea. It takes a long, long time if it's just sitting there. Smaller barrels, they got much more surface area to volume ratio. They will introduce a lot more wood flavours a lot quicker. Rye is quite spicy and peppery, and I don't want those little barrels. I don't want to hide that spiciness with wood. It's wood in malt whisky, I think, is good. In rye, I don't think it's good. There's very, very limited amount of wood you want in them. Even that 20s, certainly don't use those unless it's a little experimental thing I do. 50s, I've tried them initially, and by about 18 months they'd gone too woody. We need to leave the whisky in the wood for at least 2 years in Australia to be able to call it whisky. Yep. So I go for smallest. I use the 100 litres, and even the 100 litres in 3 years, some of those can be too woody. I very rarely ever last. 100 litre will last for 5 years. They just pick up too much wood and get out of balance, and just goes quite astringent. The little barrel there of XO brandy, I call it. It's absolutely awful. It's 10 years old, but it's been in a little 50 litre for 10 years, and it's just totally undrinkable. It is awful. The old age is certainly not necessarily better. We got a barrel here though that's a brandy that I've made for a winery. They had smoke taint. Theirs wasn't too bad, so they made a little bit of wine with it just to see how to go. Didn't like it, so they set me up a few thousand litres a few weeks ago. So I'm distilling it and barrel aging it into a brandy. So I reckon smoking wine's no good, definitely no good. A little bit, tiny bit of smoke in a brandy might be fine, especially for people used to drinking whisky. Probably very pleasant, in fact.
Peter Bignell is best known for his Belgrove rye whiskies. He has produced some malt whiskies too, some heavily peated, some hopped. And there's a whiskey called French Kissing a Stranger. Trust me, you do not want to know what he distilled that one from. But it's an example of the irreverence Peter Bignell has for tradition. For instance, there's a sign on the refrigerator door. It reads, "Do not change the temperature of this fridge." Now, you might think it's because there's yeast in there that needs to be kept cool. No. Underneath the warning, there's a second line. "The beer will explode and we will cry. Protect your beer." There's a passion that pervades everything at Belgrove Farm that makes distilling more than just a job.
We try to come in the mid-40s somewhere, but every batch is different, or can be different. Although I'm thinking I might try to standardise that, but it's a bit more work to do that.
Belgrove's whiskies have won numerous awards worldwide, but remain in very limited supply. We'll post a gallery of photos from the distillery along with this episode at whiskycast.com, and you'll find my tasting notes for Belgrove Rye at the website too. Since I know some of you are going to ask about that whiskey named French Kissing a Stranger, well, if you've ever been to a whiskey festival, you know those dump buckets everyone pours their leftover samples into, or perhaps even spit into? A few years ago at Whisky Live Paris, Peter collected the contents of those dump buckets, took them all the way back home to Tasmania, and redistilled them. Enough said. That is WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret, hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with Mackmyra's Jäktlika Swedish single malt. It's finished in Swedish berry wine casks and bottled at 46.1% ABV. The nose is, as you might expect, fruity and vibrant, with touches of berry cobbler, muted spices, burnt vanilla, and a hint of citrus. The taste has a good balance of berries, a touch of white pepper, hints of plums and toffee, and a combination of burnt vanilla and milk chocolate in the background. The finish is long, aromatic, and well-balanced with fruity notes and mild spices. I'm scoring Mackmyra's Jäktlika single malt a 92. Next up, the Glendronach's new Kingsman Edition 1989 vintage. It's a 29-year-old single malt matured in Oloroso sherry casks that is being released as a tie-in to the upcoming Kingsman movie. It's bottled at 50.1% ABV, and it may well be one of the darkest whiskeys I've seen in a long time after all those years in Oloroso casks. The nose has notes of Christmas cake, figs, dates, plums, a touch of nuttiness, and a hint of leather. The taste is thick and oily, with figs, dates, hints of allspice and ginger, raisins, and cocoa powder, with a really nice balance. If you add a few drops of water, it will open up hints of molasses and dried tobacco leaves on the palate, along with a touch of blackberries. The finish, long and subtle, with lingering touches of figs, dates, berries, and just a hint of spice. I'm scoring the Glendronach Kingsman Edition 1989 vintage a 94. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey, which will be releasing the next batch of Penny's Proof later this year. It's a preview of Sagamore Spirit Whiskey, distilled on-site in Baltimore, and last year's first release of samples sold out in hours. The only way to find out when and how to get your hands on this year's batch is to join Sagamore Spirit's Whiskey Thieves. Sign up today at sagamorespirit.com. Belgrove Distillery is Glendronach's corporate cousin and has unveiled not only new packaging, but a new core range of single malts with new peated and unpeated 10 and 12-year-old whiskeys. Since the weather's gotten a lot cooler around here in the last week or so, I started out with the peated versions. The Smoky 10 is matured in a combination of ex-bourbon, toasted virgin oak, and Jamaican rum casks. It's bottled at 46% ABV, and the nose has notes of grilled fruits, hints of ginger and almond oil, vanilla beans, and a hint of brown sugar. The taste? Toasted oak, grilled fruits, hints of baking chocolate, brown sugar, honey, and just a hint of ginger to round it out. The finish is long with hints of orange peel, baking chocolate, brown sugar, and that same hint of ginger. I'm scoring the Belgrove's Smoky 10 a 92. On the other hand, the Smoky 12 comes from ex-bourbon, sherry, and Marsala wine casks. It's also bottled at 46% ABV. The nose on this one reminds me of baked orange peel with a hint of almond oil, charred oak, and vanilla. The taste has a nice tartness that balances the smokiness with grilled pineapple, cocoa beans, and brown sugar. The finish is long and well-balanced with a gentle kiss of smoke. I'm scoring the Belgrove's the Smoky 12 a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, and I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,900 different whiskeys from all over the world. You can check it out this week at whiskycast.com. your voice is taking the week off because I have something to say this time around. I don't do commentary very often. As a journalist who tries to remain neutral, I generally prefer to keep my opinions to myself, although I do share some of them on social media from time to time. And what I'm about to say reflects my own personal opinions, and not necessarily those of our sponsors or anyone else at Cask Strength Media. You see, Jim Murray released the 2021 version of his Whiskey Bible this week, along with his picks for what he has determined are the world's best whiskies for the coming year. He gave Alberta Premium Cask Strength Rye his award as the world's best whiskey, followed by the last Stag Junior release from Buffalo Trace and Paul John's Mithuna from India. I have not tried the last two, but I have to admit that I liked the Alberta Premium Cask Strength so much that I bought a bottle of it myself. That's not what's important here, though, and neither are the awards. Frankly, those are Jim's opinions, and he has a right to express them. It's his other opinions that are important here. I've known Jim for years, and like many people in the whiskey industry, have cringed at times at the way he has a tendency to describe whiskeys in terms that, frankly, are sexist and demeaning to women. I've held back on saying anything until now. I have my own issues with Jim and didn't want to let my feelings affect that. This weekend, Becky Paskin of ourwhiskey.com, a good friend of the show, went on social media, and to use a traditional American phrase, she took Jim Murray to the woodshed. She went through the 2020 edition of the Whiskey Bible and counted 34 different references to whiskey being, quote, sexy, and what she describes as many more, quote, crudely comparing drinking whiskey to having sex with women. Here's one of her tweets quoting those references, and I'm quoting it word for word. Penderyn is made by an all-female team of distillers and blenders, yet this is how he refers to their whiskey. If this was a woman, I'd want to make love to it every night, and in the morning and afternoon, if I could find the time and energy. Becky and Georgie Bell founded Our Whiskey to help promote diversity in the whiskey world, not just among those who make whiskey, but those who drink it as well. And it's a goal that we here at WhiskyCast have always been proud to support without question. There's been a lot of progress made in recent years. In fact, all 4 of the whiskeys I just reviewed a few minutes ago were made by women. Angela Forsgren-Durazio at Mackmyra and Rachel Berry at the Glendronach and Benriach. That was not my objective when I started working on this week's podcast. I tasted those whiskeys before Becky went public with her comments. It just happened to work out that way, and I didn't even think about that until I started writing this commentary. That's the way it should be, looking at whiskeys based on their own merits and not the gender, race, or anything else about the people who made them. In Becky's words, a book that contains language like this erases much of that progress and allows the objectification of women in whiskey. All I can say is, to use a biblical term, amen. I'm pretty sure Jim will never listen to this episode. He was a guest several times in the early years of WhiskyCast, but has not been invited to come on the show in recent years, and I don't plan to invite him on ever again. But on the chance he is listening, Jim, it's time to grow up. And as Becky Paskin said, this has to stop. learn to show some respect for women in whiskey and in life. The dinosaurs are extinct, and your attitudes are just as ancient. Your voice will return next week. In the meantime, if you have a comment, a suggestion, or a question, you can always find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that make the world of whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. What is a spectral signal? No, it's not the way the Avengers call Doctor Strange in the Marvel movies. But a spectral signal could be a way to help identify counterfeit whiskeys. There have been a lot of fake whiskeys turning up at auctions and on the secondary market over the years, some so skillfully done on the surface that they even fool distillery managers from time to time. Scientists have been trying to come up with ways to authenticate vintage whiskeys. We did a segment in December of 2018 with Professor Gordon Cook of the Scottish University's Environmental Research Centre. He uses radiocarbon dating to determine how old a whiskey really is. And you can listen to that interview in episode 747 in the archives at whiskycast.com. The problem is that all of the methods for authenticating whiskeys until now have required actually extracting a sample of the whiskey from inside the bottle, either by using a syringe to go through the cork or by actually opening up the bottle. As you might guess, both have their drawbacks. The website Ars Technica reported on the issue this week. The Scotch Whisky Research Institute, which gets its funding from the industry, has been testing a portable spectrometer that shines a laser into a whiskey sample. The liquid scatters the light into different wavelengths based on the chemical composition of the liquid and creates what's called a spectral signal. That doesn't work, though, when the whiskey is still in the bottle, since the glass produces its own spectral signal. Holly Fleming of the University of St. Andrews has a Ph.D. in optical medical imaging and analytical chemistry. She and her colleagues have figured out a solution to that problem. Their paper in the journal Analytical Methods turns the bottle into a lens. Here's how. Instead of the focused beam of light that we're used to seeing when we think of lasers, they came up with a way to shape it into a ring using a cone-shaped lens. When the light hits the bottle, the glass refocuses the light into the whiskey, and that allows the whiskey's spectral signal to be collected without wasting a single drop and determine whether it's the real thing or not. If you want to dig deeper into just how the process works, we've posted links for both the Ars Technica story and the research paper at the WhiskyCast website. And if there's something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes all the way back to 2005. We'd love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.